Hi, and welcome back to Luke Talks. Most people today probably think that the scientific worldview emerged out of an opposition to various religious superstitions, right? Well, it turns out that this is actually not true at all, and that what we now call the modern scientific worldview pretty much emerged out of the church itself in opposition to different religious traditions or different theological approaches that were quite common back then in the 16th and 17th century. To see what I mean, let's have a look at what went on at that time. We pretty much have what might be called Christian supernaturalism, which was the official church doctrine, if you will, and that's the idea that we have the created world or our physical world, and then we have God, who is all-powerful, omnipotent, and can basically suspend the laws of nature at will. So that's the supernaturalism part, right? And that's also how the church explained the miracles in the Bibles. It's basically just the supernatural God suspending the laws of nature, right? Because he's all powerful, he can do anything. So that's the idea. On the other hand, you have the scholastic tradition or the Aristotelian view. And this is all connected to goals, inherent goals in nature. Every material thing has an essence, right? So that's kind of this tradition that I won't get into too much right now, because we have a third tradition or a third view that was pretty widespread at the time, which is called Hermeticism, or sometimes also called the magical tradition. And this is about things like alchemy and astrology and things like that. And we'll get to a minute why this is so important. So basically what we have here is a conflict between Christian supernaturalism and Hermeticism. And the conflict is this. As I said, in the Christian view, the miracles are a cause of God basically suspending the laws of nature because he's supernatural, right? In the Hermetic view, however, things like magic can happen in our world. Things like what we might today call psychokinesis or precognition, apparitions, and things like that. So in that view, what the church called miracles, or what the Bible called miracles, is basically something natural, right? So you don't need a supernatural entity to bring these about. You don't need to suspend the laws of nature, if you will, because it's something natural. It just can happen. It's part of nature. So in the church's view, this kind of undermines their authority, right? Because Christianity is supposed to be true, and proof of the one truth, the only truth of Christianity in large parts rests on the miracles, right? So that's a huge problem for the church if those people who are more into Hermeticism gain the upper hand. But it needs also to be said, these were not like heretics in the strict sense, because they obviously believed in God too. So this whole discussion, we need to remember, takes place at a time where people were religious. So that's not the issue whether God exists or anything like that. It's just a different interpretation, right? But the Hermetic tradition, as I said, was a threat to the church. So let's have a look at the Christian supernaturalism. As I said, it's the idea that we have a supernatural God and we have a mechanistic world. And that was kind of the answer that the church had, right? So that's what they came up with. So they said, no, these kinds of magical things, they cannot happen. Only God can bring them about as a supernatural being. And our physical world it's purely mechanical or mechanistic, right? So that's what today we call materialism. So the idea that the world consists only of matter, there is nothing else. Of course, for the Christians at the time, there was God as a supernatural being, but the natural world was purely mechanistic. There were no spirits or no action at a distance or things like that, right? So that's actually how our materialistic mindset or our materialistic philosophy that is now pretty standard originates. That was a reaction against the Hermetic tradition. And the church basically said, we live in a materialist universe, except that, of course, there's God as a supernatural being. And that's also the origin of all God of the gaps arguments, right? Because the materialist, mechanistic view of the world has some problems, such as the interaction with mind, right? So how can the mind and the bodies interact? And there are all kinds of problems with this materialist mindset. And for the religious people at the time, of course, God was always the solution. God was the supernatural being. He could do whatever he wants. So he made sure that our minds interact with the world and all of that. And he was basically the answer for all the problems that are inherent in this mechanistic worldview. But it also was a defense against the Hermetic tradition, because in that view, the miracles in the Bible were purely the work of God, the supernatural being who could do something that is otherwise impossible, right? So let's read a quote here from Wikipedia, and this is pretty important. It's a guy called Marine Mersenne, a French father who pretty much came up with this mechanistic, materialistic philosophy, right? So, quote from Wikipedia, during the mid-1630s, Mersenne gave up the search for physical causes in the Aristotelian sense, rejecting the idea of essences, which were still favored by the scholastic philosophers, and taught that true physics could only be a descriptive science of motions, mécanisme. So that was basically his brainchild, and it sounds very familiar, right? Because that's kind of the worldview that many people and many scientists have today. It's kind of the official scientific doctrine, right? So let's switch to Hermeticism, which you can read up on Wikipedia if you're interested. Quote, much of the importance of Hermeticism arises from its connection with the development of science during the time from 1300 to 1600 AD. The prominence that it gave to the idea of influencing or controlling nature led many scientists to look to magic and its allied arts, like alchemy, astrology, which it was thought could put nature to the test by means of experiments. Consequently, it was the practical aspects of Hermetic writings that attracted the attention of scientists. Isaac Newton placed great faith in the concept of an unadulterated, pure, ancient doctrine, which he studied vigorously to aid his understanding of the physical world. So that's pretty interesting that Isaac Newton was very much into this sort of esoteric things, right? Because that's basically what it was. It's the Western esoteric tradition, including things like magic and actions at a distance and all of that. Of course, nowadays, modern science pretty much denies things like that, this kind of what you might call magic things, right? So modern science is kind of a combination of this mechanistic worldview that was the church's reaction against Hermeticism, and Hermeticism itself, like the idea to experiment and to have like a more naturalistic worldview instead of a supernaturalistic worldview, right? Is there a different kind of naturalism? That's the question, right? because we nowadays think of naturalism pretty much as materialism or even atheist materialism. And I think especially for people nowadays who are kind of interested in religion again, who might be recovering atheists, so to say, that's an interesting thought, because one of the reasons people don't believe in God or are becoming atheists, I think, is because they reject this kind of supernaturalist mindset, this kind of God, the supernatural being that can suspend the laws of nature at whim, right? So that seems kind of strange for the modern mind, and for good reasons, right? So the question is, can we kind of go back to a more Hermeticist tradition and have a more naturalistic outlook on these things? Can we be naturalists but still maybe think about deeper issues without falling into complete materialism? So let's have a look at what today's scientific naturalism usually entails, and why it might be not really sufficient, and why people might be interested again in religion and in other things. So the dogma nowadays is pretty much this. First, there is nothing supernatural, right? That's the naturalism part. Everything is natural. But then there are some specifications that emerged over the centuries, let's say, and that are pretty much ingrained in today's modern mindset. The first is that perception is possible only through the senses. So in other words, our connection to the world is purely physical, right? That we can only see or hear or smell or whatever through our sense organs. There's no extrasensory perception. It just is denied that this is possible at all. And in this connection, we have materialism, which is the idea that nothing exists except matter, right? So along with this, there's the idea that our brains are purely physical and are identical with our minds, right? That's pretty much a standard view today, that our brain is our mind, that there's no difference. It's all just material and physiological, nothing else going on there. So that's pretty standard. And then, of course, we have the atheist view that's also pretty standard in the scientific world, which of course is the idea that there is no God. It's just nothing, no higher being or higher intelligence exists. It's all nonsense, basically. So the question then is, can there be a naturalism, a different kind of naturalism that is not so restrictive? Because many people, and myself included, kind of feel that this modern scientific mindset is kind of limiting and doesn't really take into account the whole range of the human experience, of our experience of the world, right? And let's see if there's an alternative. So, a different naturalism, how could it look like? First, of course, the first premise is the same. There is nothing supernatural. So that means there is no God that can do whatever he wants with the natural world, and that there is no God that is completely separate from the natural world. So we look at everything in a naturalistic way. Everything is part of nature, if you will. But with this different naturalism, nature is defined more broadly. It's not so narrowly defined that, everything is material and all of that. And the first thing is that maybe extrasensory perception is possible. That's an interesting question, right? And you might think, how can extrasensory perception be part of a natural worldview? Here are a few examples of how extrasensory perception might look like. Take, for example, mathematics. It's a huge problem in philosophy because we can kind of discover mathematical truth, right? By all kinds of mathematical operations and mathematical proof and all of that. There are always new things discovered in mathematics. But what is really discovered? I mean, it's not that we discover it through our senses doing an experiment or something like that, right? So maybe that's one instance of extrasensory perception, where we perceive truth and certain realities in a different way using mathematics. That may be an example. Another one is dreams. We all have dreams, and sometimes they can carry a lot of information, and the question is, where does this information come from? So you might say it comes from the unconscious. Okay, but then, as Jordan Peterson has asked as well, where does this information come from? And sometimes it can be very helpful indeed, right? So that's the idea behind like dream work in psychotherapy. Still another instance might be morals, right? Ethical values. Because if we suppose that there is something like objective morality, then the question is, how do we know these values, right? How can we know them? And if our conscience tells us something, then maybe that's still another case of perception that is not strictly sensual. Now, of course, within this narrow scientific, modern, materialist, atheist mindset, this cannot possibly be. So it's always denied that such things are possible. So maybe, people come up with evolutionary stories on why we have developed a conscious and all of that, conscience. But maybe it doesn't really fly, because if we think of moral values as something that points to the future, as a possible future, let's say, then the question is, how can we know that this is a good or this is a bad future, or which future is better than the other? So there seems to be something going on. And Jordan Peterson also talks about our innate sense of meaning, that we kind of know when we're doing something meaningful, when everything is kind of stacked and lined up properly. So that might be another instance of how we perceive things, not strictly through our senses. We kind of know that this is a good path ahead, that a better future awaits us if we keep doing what we're doing, right? So these are all instances of extrasensory perception. And of course, there's also the whole field of parapsychology, of things like telepathy and stuff like that. And contrary to a popular belief, there's actually mountains of evidence that these things happen, right? But even if you don't believe that, still, I think we all share this experience that there's something more to our perception than strictly what comes through our senses, right? And why can't this be part of nature? Why can't this be studied, like scientifically studied, just as Isaac Newton did, and those in the hermeneutic tradition or Hermeticist tradition did. Then in our new naturalism, we have a non-physical reality, right? So that's the idea, as I said, with mathematics, where do the mathematical forms and numbers and structures come from, really? Is there a thought world, let's say, a non-physical reality? And again, it's not so far out. I mean, the materialist dogma that there cannot possibly be such a thing has tons of philosophical problems that are very well recognized and increasingly recognized. And if we have a non-physical reality, why can't this be part of nature, right? The world of thought, the Platonic world of forms, if you will. So that's another part of a different naturalism that might be part of the picture here. Now, in addition to that, you have the idea of God, right? So the idea here is that it's not just that there's a non-physical reality, a world of thought, a world of forms and all of that, but that this reality is alive, right? It's not just a dead reality where we can discover things or maybe perceive stuff, but it's very much alive. It's part of a mind, right? So that's the idea of God. It's something intelligent. It's something that acts and that can have a causal influence on our material world, and that our material world even can have a causal influence on, right? So that's another difference between Christian supernaturalism, where everything flows from God. But the idea here is that this mind, this higher mind, interacts with us in both directions, in a sense. Let's say a mathematical construct in that view is kind of an idea in the higher mind, and as such it like influences our world, which is kind of embedded in this non-physical world, which is part of a mind, just like our neurons and our brain is part of our mind. So that's an interesting idea. At this point, you really might ask, what does this has to do with naturalism? Isn't this complete, like supernaturalism? But it really depends on how you think about it, because supernaturalism usually means that there is something higher, but it's completely separated from our reality, from our world. It's supernatural. It's beyond nature. But in this view, these realities are pretty much part and parcel of nature. It's just a higher form of reality, right? But it's still natural processes. It's still governed by certain mechanisms, certain laws, certain principles, and it's all pretty much alive. It's just a very different view of the cosmos, right? And it's kind of hard for us today to even think about these things, because we are so trained or with this materialist, atheist, non-extrasensory perception kind of dogma, right? And dogma is what it is. It's a philosophy. And it's hard for us to think outside this small little box. But why not affirm that there are higher realities, that there's more going on with our perception, there's more going on with our consciousness, and it's all embedded and related. Why not call this natural, and why not study it, and come to a deeper understanding of the world and of our place in it, and of our values, our moral virtues, and all of that. I think it's a very interesting idea. And if you want to know more about it, I can recommend this book by David Ray Griffin, God Exists But God Does Not: From Evil to New Atheism to Fine-Tuning. It's a really excellent book, and I got most of the information that I just presented here out of that book and other writings of David Ray Griffin. And even though one might not agree with every position he utters there, it's really nice to read these books, to set the record straight, and to escape this narrow box of what we now call modern scientific worldview, but which used to be something very different, and which, ironically enough, uh, and it's ironic indeed, emerged out of Christians trying to defend their miracles, right? So, in a sense, even the most diehard atheist, materialist scientists that live today and that they wouldn't never accept anything outside of this narrow mindset, they are descendants of a church defending supernatural miracles, right? So that's actually pretty funny. So that should be it for now, folks. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I made sense and that you got something out of it. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.